got it. All right.
Shalom, Nechama.
Shalom, shalom. Okay, so we left off last time with a whole bunch of questions. We didn't quite get through the, I wanted to show you something. I don't know how, actually I should stop the share for a minute. And so this here in this Chumash, this is what, whoops, it's on this side. Okay. This is what I was talking about. Chapter 3 is going on, and then there's this big gap. Then there are those last 3 verses of chapter 3, and it just keeps going. Chapter 4, there's no break between the end of chapter 3 and the beginning of chapter 4, and it just keeps going. It keeps going and going and going and going and going, okay, until it finally gets to the end of verse 25 of chapter 4. And then there's the rest of chapter, trying to show, then there's the rest of chapter 4, and then there's an even bigger break. You know, here, whoops, it's hard for me to do it. I'm watching myself in the camera. It's not working so well always. Here, this right here is kind of a smallish break. That says that the previous part, the earlier part of chapter 4 and the later part of chapter 4 are kind of connected. There's a little bit of a break, not a big break. Whereas down here, you see there's a great big break between the end of chapter 4 till the beginning of chapter 5. That's like a whole change of scene. But what we saw over here, see, that's a bigger break than the other one was. All right. And so these breaks are the way our Masorah has of indicating which parts are connected and which parts are not connected. So that was what I was talking about last time. Now, Malbim and Ramat Vali actually understand it in 2 different ways. Ramat Vali actually, in this case, does read it together, essentially with the Christian typesetters. Very interesting. He says that those last 3 lines in what we call nowadays we call chapter 3, were one letter, or the introduction basically to one letter, without a whole lot of detail in it, but it was one letter that Nebuchadnezzar sent out immediately after the signs and miracles that there were at the time of the Kivshan Ha'esh. You know, he had set up this big statue. Everybody was supposed to bow down to it. Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah don't. He throws them into the Kivshan Ha'esh. And Gabriel comes down and cools off the fire from within and heats it up to the outside. And they walk around, you know, pleasantly nice summer day inside this thing. And he's like, okay, you know, this is clearly not your average run-of-the-mill Avodah Zarah stuff going on here. This is something else altogether. And so he sends, so according to the Ramat Vali, those last 3 psukim in chapter 3 are actually, he's sending notice to everybody that this great miracle had happened. But then, but it's interesting, both he and the Malbim does not think that's the case. The Malbim thinks, the way I had indicated, that the Masorah put in a break. This entire thing from verse 31 of chapter 3 until verse 25 of chapter 4 is as though Daniel had slipped in a copy of the proclamation that Nebuchadnezzar had sent, had slipped it into his diary. Okay, and so we're just reading the proclamation, and this is the whole thing from beginning to end. But what they do agree on is that Nebuchadnezzar basically took all of this as God's communicating with him. He's such a big guy. God's communicating with him. All right. So Ramat Valley says that Ramat Valley actually brings some very interesting things on that. So I'll tell you him first. On those verses. Here we go again. Right here. So on those same verses, we've seen them now several times in a row. He says, I'm Nebuchadnezzar the king, right? And I'm telling everybody in the whole world, B'kol Ara, right? Because why? Because he's such a big guy. He's the emperor of the whole world. And then when he talks about these Ataya v'Timhaya, Ramat Valley doesn't differentiate for us what those are. But he says, right, Di avad imi, that God did with me. He did these things for me. Okay. And meaning even this business of saving Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah, Nebuchadnezzar took it as God's communicating directly to him, and that this is all being done for Nebuchadnezzar's benefit. To correct him that he was mistaken, that he thought that, that he could be king down below and not so much interacting with God, who was king up above. And so God gave him sort of a gentle, as it were, object lesson so that he could learn this, but he took it all to himself. And the root of his problem is that he has an overweening arrogance and pride, and doesn't yet get fixed. All right. And so he says, Shvar kadamai lahachbaya, and so it's good, right? That was also one of the questions we had. What does it mean? It's good that I should tell over about these miracles. It's, like, what does that mean? Well, because Ramat Valley tells us that what it means is that he's taking this to a place of yet more arrogance. He's really not getting the lesson he's supposed to get from it. And he does answer Malbim's question, his answer to Malbim's question about why does it say Malchute Malchut Alam? He says that his kingdom is a kingdom of the entire world. In other words, I thought, said Nebuchadnezzar, that I ruled down here, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu came right into the very midst of my court, as it were, and showed this sign by saving Chanai, Mishael, and Azariah, that in fact he's the king. God, the holy king, is also the king down here in the place of Tumah, not just up above in, as it were, in the place of holiness. And so that's why he says his kingdom, Malchute Malchut Olam. V'shal Tanei im dar v'dar, he says, is he's referencing that past, present, and future is also all under God's control, and that's the im dar v'dar, that even when it appears to me or appears to us that God is not running the show, I now understand that really and truly God is running the show. But he still sees it as all directed at him. It's to me, it reminds me about, there were some of our Gedolim think it was told about Rav Kamenetsky, but I'm not positive. So, or maybe Rav Kanievsky, I get the names mixed up. But at any rate, he would walk around. He had 2 slips of paper, one for each pocket. Okay. And so basically one of them said that the world was created for me. And the other one, what do I remember? Oh, I don't remember the exact wording of the second one, but the other one was, on the level of reminding me that I'm just Afer ve'efer, right? That I'm just dust and ashes. That I have to have a balance between the two. Ad k'dei kach that evidently he found himself one year on Chol Moed, which is a time when typically people don't write. I'm not living my life at that level that I'm so careful about Malacha on Chol Moed, but he certainly was. And there are people who are very careful about what kinds of Malacha they do on Chol Moed and which they do not. And it's somewhere between Minhag and Halacha. It's an interesting place there. But at any rate, he all of a sudden picked up opened a drawer, took out a pen, and wrote these verses down on these two little pieces of paper and stuck one into one pocket and one into the other pocket. And later on, people asked him, what was it? Because they were very surprised to see him writing on Chol Moed. And so that was when he explained to them, he said, I'm going to have a lot of people coming and asking me questions and asking me to help them solve problems or to give them brachot or whatever. And it might go to my head. I might think it's all about me. It's not about me. It's about God. It's about his Torah. And so I need, I need to have that in my pocket. When we talk about Torah, a Torah in your pocket that you can just like pull out and give over your Dvar Torah. But for him, it was literally he felt he needed to have that in his pocket, and yet on the other hand, he also felt he needed to have the balance, because if you become too humble, as it were, then you might not believe that you actually have the capability of answering the questions that the people are coming to him to ask. And he needed that balance. And so this reminds me so much of Nebuchadnezzar didn't have that balance. God did this for me. Look what he did for me. It's because it's all about me. And it's like, really? That kind of guy that just drives the Shekhinah away. What? It's so crazy. But Ramat Vali sees these 3 verses here as truly being a continuation from chapter 3. And then chapter 4 he tells over about the dream, and that he asked for other people to come, and then he remembered, he was so distraught from the dream that he forgot that he had Daniel on tap, literally, that he forgot. So he called everybody in. Ramat Vali tells us that the first time he couldn't even remember what the dream was. He just had the emotional response to it when he woke up, but all in a tizzy. But he couldn't even remember it. And Ramat Vali says that was because the Kadosh Baruch Hu wanted to lahagdil et tzaddik, to make what Daniel was able. That tzaddik in Ramat Vali is always referring to Daniel, at least in this Sefer, And so he wanted him to have this, this possibility of being raised up from, he was just barely, had just barely graduated from the school that was training him to be an official, some level of official for the king's court. And he had just graduated, and it was, wasn't even really, didn't yet have his first position, and God wanted to raise him up. And so he made he made it a bigger deal by not letting Nebuchadnezzar remember. So then when Daniel was able to both bring forth what the dream was, as well as giving a resolution for the dream, that was huge, because that's not something that you can really do without prophecy. And so it was really huge, and it made him much more respected in the eyes of everybody there. He goes on to say, but this time Nebuchadnezzar remembered what the dream was, and he called everybody else in again. Why does he call everybody else in again? Because, Kadosh Baruch Hu, again, he wants to give more covet and within the eyes of the Babylonian court to Daniel. And so he first has the king call in all of the other soothsayers, diviners, et cetera, et cetera. And they're really happy, because they're like, and this time he even remembered what the dream was. And so they're like, even if we don't get it 100% right, it's a chance for us to redeem ourselves, as it were. And then the verse, he says, and he's telling it over. We talked about these psukim. And then in verse 4, where he says, Ufishre lo mahodin li, they didn't tell me its solution. They didn't tell me any solution, says Ramat Valley. They didn't tell him a solution at all. They were there. He told them over the dream, and they were like stricken dumb. And Ramat Valley brings a lovely pasuk from Sefer Yeshayahu, which is not going to show up on my. Oh, maybe it will. Shows up on my screen a little bit. Anyway, it was the Ramat Valley brought this verse about Meshiv Chachamim Achor Udatam Yisaker, that God turns, particularly the idea of being like the natural philosophers, he turns their wisdom backwards, and he makes them look like fools. And that's what happened here. And so then all of a sudden, oh, wait a minute, he says, that's right, I've got Daniel. Let me ask Daniel, because Daniel knows how to do this. Okay. And so that's how he gets around to asking Daniel to come. Ramat Valley says this whole thing, we can read it, and we should see that the hand of God is in all of this, and that we can see God orchestrating everything that is going on here. But what about the Malbim? The Malbim was the one who had asked us, the questions about this. So he actually sees these 3 verses here as an introduction to the letter. He does not see these as 2 separate things. He doesn't see these 3 verses as a response to the Kivshan Ha'esh, and then the story of the dream and bringing in Daniel and telling over what the dream is. And then I think we got as far as Daniel was like, don't really want to tell you what this dream means. Okay. But I don't think we actually got into what Daniel's actual answer to him. Because he starts off, these three verses start off, Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar, the king, to everybody. Okay. And then he starts off saying, Anna Nebuchadnezzar. And so Ramad Valley sees these as two separate documents. The Malbim sees it as one. The Malbim had a couple of interesting insights. And in which case, by the way, because the deal is that we got as far as the place in the dream where this holy messenger, watcher, whatever, this Kaddish Be'ir, Ir Kaddish, had decreed that the tree was going to be cut down and bound in fetters, and then all of a sudden it switches and it's going to be like one of the animals, and it's going to partake of the herbage of the field and be watered by the dew of the heavens. And like it made such a strange switch, and that the heart, the understanding heart of a man was going to be taken away. What tree has that? Okay, so it's a dream, and in dreams, like you can switch essentially from one kind of parable, one kind of imagery to a different kind of imagery, and still have it be about the same subject. And that was what was going on. And we got, and we heard that part of the decree was that 7 years should pass, and then the tree was going to grow again. Then at any rate, but 7 years were going to pass, and then the understanding, the human understanding, was going to come back, and that was about where we'd gotten to. And Daniel doesn't want to have to explain this, because the first dream, explaining the first dream to the king, he was able to say to the king, look, this is about you. You're a king. It's reasonable for you to be concerned about what's going to be the future of your kingdom and of your subjects, etc. And so God gave you an answer to that. And furthermore, he was able to say to Nebuchadnezzar, right, and you're the head of gold. So you've got somebody who's an emperor who has a fair degree of self-pride. And you tell him that he's the head and he's like the gold, he's not going to get too upset with you. But what we're going to see here is that this tree, and then this being that loses its humanity and becomes like an animal for a period of time, that this is also about Nebuchadnezzar. And to tell a king that he's about to be cut down in his prime and spend 7 years crazy, like not even, like so crazy he doesn't even remember that he's human, is not something that Daniel wanted to do. And that was about as far as we had gotten. And so we'll go back into the Aramaic and actually read it inside. But Malvin sees actually this whole thing as a piece. And so when is this letter being written? This letter isn't being written before those 7 years of having lost his mind. This letter is being written afterwards. Okay. In other words, he has this dream. Daniel explains to him what the dream means. I mean, I'll tell you from the outside anyway, because it's not actually pshat in the psukim. Chazal understand from some of the things that Daniel says that Daniel gives him advice as to what he could do to try to put off the actualization of this decree. And Nebuchadnezzar does it for a while, and then his arrogance gets the better of him. And as soon as his arrogance gets the better of him again, then the decree snaps down on him, and he spends 7 years totally not able to communicate like a human being, much less be like a king. And then he returns to his throne. He returns to himself, and he comes back to the throne. And so this letter is being written, according to Malbim, the entire thing, the first 3 verses as well, the entire thing is being written after he comes back to himself. And so Malbim does us a nice favor. He asks the question, why does it say both ataya v'timhaya? In Hebrew, it would be ototu moftim. It goes very much with the part of Shmot that we've been reading until now, signs and wonders, otot and moftim. And Malbim tells us, if you want to see it on the inside, I can open it up for you. Under the Mefarshim, you can see it in Malbim. But he explains that that otot are things which go in according to derech hateva. Okay, so what's an ot? For instance, the rainbow is an ot. The rainbow is a sign. It's a sign that shows us about God's hashgacha, but it's within nature. Me personally, I would say that the fact that the fruits and produce of Eretz Yisrael, for many years, Eretz Yisrael was not producing at all. While Am Yisrael was in exile, this land was not quite barren, but it did not give a good living. It did not produce a lot. And so it had a small population, relatively speaking. It was not very densely populated because it was pretty barren here and pretty empty. And the fruits that it produced were kind of stunted, and it wasn't anything terribly special. And when the Jews started to come back, it's not just that we've got good scientists and that, we came with a better understanding of agriculture than the people before us. The land is producing more and more and more. The taste is amazing. The size and the beauty of the fruits that Eretz Yisrael produces are a sign, okay? But it's a sign within nature. So according to Malbim, okay, signs are within nature as opposed to the moftim, which are here. I'm talking about this part down here where he was talking about it, as opposed to a mofet is something where nature essentially gets broken. Okay, that an ot shows is something that it can happen, in nature, but it happens in such a way that it's understood that there is hashgacha. It happens in such a way that it's understood that it's not a coincidence, but that there is somebody directing traffic, directing the show. And that would be an ot. And the timhaya, right? Tmiha is this language of astonishment, right? Wonders. Those are things which are outside of nature. And so the Malbim does address this doubled language. It's always something that he pays attention to. Why do you say it two ways when you could have just said it one way? He always pays attention to that. And he usually learns something out of it. He also recognizes this business of with me as being the arrogance, as it were. He says that Nebuchadnezzar, from beginning to end, has a problem in recognizing God's hashgacha, and so God has to keep driving it home to him that of the hashgacha. And so, but it's interesting. So here he doesn't see so much as being an expression, this imi as being an expression of the arrogance, as much as being an acknowledgement of hashgacha prati, not just hashgacha klali, of hashgacha that, makes sure that the world keeps ticking over, but of hashgacha that's aimed particularly at each person. And he says, I see that. And so he's also then reading the Shvar Kadamai L'Hachavaya, that it's good, appropriate for me to tell this over, not the way Ramad Valley read it, because it just adds to my importance in everybody else's eyes to see that the high God, the holy God, did these things for me, but rather it's important that all of the nations should be able to recognize God's hashgacha also. And so it's my job, as it were, to tell it over. So the Malbim, in a way, is, but also, since the Malbim reads these three verses as part of the entire document that's coming at the end after he spent 7 years totally out of his mind, I can't imagine anything more humbling to somebody who had been powerful and smart. That was such a part of his self-identity, to spend 7 years without being able to communicate, without being able to access those parts of him that he had thought of as the most important. So that, according to Malbim, right, that humbled him enough that now when he's, so because Malbim sees this whole thing as being written afterwards, so he recognizes that there was an issue of arrogance, but that was before. And then after the humbling, the assumption is that at least for a while, Nebuchadnezzar is going to get over it. Okay, so there's a difference then. So there's a difference between how the two of them do this. So remember, the Malbim had asked the question, why does Nebuchadnezzar start off by saying, I was, I had such peace and quiet. Just everything was running along just the way you would want. Shlei havet beveti, right? And Malbim says, why did he start off with that? I suggested, I have a Baruch Shekivanti moment. I suggested just like the verse in the Torah that says Vayeshev Yaakov, and then Chazal say, and immediately he got the problems with Dinah and the sale of Yosef, and Yehuda going down from his level. Like all these things happened. Why? Because Akash Baruch Hu said to him, what makes you think that this world is a place of shalva and menucha? That's for the next world. This world is a place of work. This, you need to work on yourself. You need to look around you and see what needs to be done for other people, how I can make myself a better person, a better merkava for the Shekhinah. And you don't get to sit back and say, oh, I think I've done enough and I get to, now I get to. Now, that doesn't mean that Akash Baruch Hu doesn't from time to time, actually, at least once a week on Shabbos. Thank you so much for Shabbat Me'in Olam Haba. But it doesn't mean that you don't ever get a pause that lets you take a deep breath and contemplate what's been before, what's going to be. Of course, there's place for that, but don't expect that, okay, I've put in all my work and now I get to retire and sit on my laurels and I don't have to keep working. Like, that's not the way it goes, right? That was what Chazal tell us about Yaakov Avinu. And Ramat Vali, at least, his answer, I mean, Malbim is later than Ramat Vali. It's not like the Ramat Vali was answering Malbim, but he's answering the same question. He says to us, this business of saying, oh, everything is, there's shalva and it's all sweet and good and restful and everything else. That's sort of the, how do they put it? Pride goes before the fall. And again, the Ramat Vali is hitting over and over again on this issue of Nebuchadnezzar being, having this state of gaiva, but, and of pride, but he says that anytime that a person sees everything is being fine, that sort of invites, he says it invites kitrug, it invites prostitution. Okay, it invites jealousy on the part of others. That's also a problem. But when a person thinks that they have it really good and that they don't need to be working and they don't need to be looking around to see what else needs to be done in this world, that's just asking for the prosecuting voices of the world to come, whether it's because of jealousy or whatever. In a sense, that's the beginning of the story with Eov. We see it over and over again in Tanakh. And so that was the Ramat Vali's response to this. Okay, and he explains it, but Malbim's response to this is so his first response is to tell you that this dream that I'm about to tell you about is not a response to, so he's just going on a much sort of simpler level, as it were. We know that one thing that causes dreams is the experiences you had during the day. And so Nebuchadnezzar is telling us and telling, the people that he's writing to, things were going just fine. I didn't have a nightmare, a scary dream, okay, because I'd had difficulty in my life, but rather I had the scary dream because it was a message from God, okay, which was scary, and rightfully so. But you shouldn't think, it's, of course he was worried about these different things and everything was going hard. And so he had a dream that responded to the difficulties that he was having in his life and in the kingdom at that time, because everything was just fine. My house was just fine. Malbim brings also a note saying that Shalva versus Shalom. Shalva refers to the inner state of equilibrium and equanimity, as opposed to Shalom, which is a state of being at peace and working together with others. But he had both, and Ra'anan behechali, and everything was vital and good and vigorous in my palace, which is like saying in the court. Everything was just fine. This dream did not, so Mom was just telling us, the dream did not come out of stuff that was going on in his life. It wasn't a response to that. It was, now, Ramad Valley will tell you it was a response to that because it was a response to the Kitrug. Okay, it was a response to the you think you've got it all good. Okay, let's open up your teak. Let's open up your file and see whether you deserve to have it this good. So they both have a reason as to why it is that the verse has to tell us that, but they're going sort of in different places with it. I'm trying to remember whether there was more stuff. We talked a little bit, I think, about Nebuchadnezzar's using the name Belshazzar like the name of my God. But so one of them says, that this was an attempt to sort of to take control over Daniel, to make him subservient to the forces of Tuma, to, as it were, to, the word's coming out in Hebrew, to megayes, to like draft him into the side of Tuma. And the other way of reading it is, even though he was called after my God, but really that's not, but really we see though that it's so, and again, it depends. There are people who translate this Elohim Kadishin as God's plural with a small g, and there are others who translate it basically as Elohim Hakadosh Baruch Hu. That Nebuchadnezzar was recognizing that Daniel had at minimum Ruach HaKodesh, if not full out Nevuah for him. And this calling him Rav Chartumaya, that was his title at the time. And so then he starts to tell about the dream. And so I will go back through all the details, but the problem is the minute that I start to go through the details, both Mefarshim are already giving the solution to the dream as they explain what the various details in the dream mean. And I was trying to present it the way Nebuchadnezzar is presenting it. So I had this dream and I don't know what its solution is. And I need to call on Daniel to give me the solution. So I want to let us hear Daniel's solution to it first before I go back and tell over how both Malbim and Ramat Valley in particular, and, here and there, some other Meforshim as well, but how we see it, whether it's on a remez level, on a drush level, or Ramat Valley, Mamash all of a sudden goes down into the sod level. One thing, though, that the Ramat Valley does point out, and I sort of alluded to last week, because we're right around Tu B'Shvat, right? We just had Tu B'Shvat last week. We were in the lead up to it, and now we've just had it. And here we have this thing about a tree, and then all of a sudden it turns over to having this heart of a human. And so the Ramat Valley references the verse from Devarim, where now he's taking it out of context along with almost everybody else. It says, Ha'adam etz hasadeh. But in its context, I did just teach this yesterday. In its context, it's talking about Bal Tashchi. Don't destroy, don't cut down the trees. When you go to wage war on a city, don't cut down the trees because you're going to need to eat from them. And then it says, Hadam etz hasadeh and what it's really asking, it's not stating the person is a tree of the field. What it's really saying is what? You think that a tree is a person that you need to wage war on the trees? Don't cut down the trees. Okay? In the verse, in the Devarim, that's what it's really saying. But the Kabbalistic sources, the Hasidic sources following along on them, pull out those words totally out of the context of don't wage war on trees, to saying not reading it as a question, which is the way it is in the Pshat, but they read it as a person is. There are parallels between the life of a human being and the life of a tree, right? You grow, you produce fruit. If you get cut down before your time, that's one way of dying. But even if you make it to a ripe old age, trees live longer than most people, but nonetheless, depends on the species, I guess. But even a tree will eventually die of old age, and it loses its branches, and we lose our hair, and there are lots of parallels in a sense between a tree that recognizes, it knows its roots, it finds its nourishment from its environment. There's so many parallels that can be made. And so it's reasonable, as it were, for Nebuchadnezzar in his dream to see himself as this huge tree. Okay, so as I said, I really want to get at least through that verse 25, so that when I give over the explanations of the dream, that we've already heard Daniel, because I want to hear Daniel's. I want to hear, actually, what we're going to hear is Nebuchadnezzar telling over Daniel. We're not hearing Daniel directly. This is all still in this letter from Nebuchadnezzar. But I did want to at least look at, where were we? Okay, so there was this tree, and it had shade, and the animals had a place in it, and the birds had a place in it, and then came this Irva Kaddish. So Malbim had asked the question, why does it say two things? Because Malbim always has issues about why do you say two things? Okay. And right, Va'alu Irva Kaddish min Shmaya. So what is this? So Malbim tells us, Sheyarad min Shemayim malach shenikra Irva Kaddish. He says it's a single angel that's called both Ir and Kaddish. The word Ir, the Malbim tells us, means an angel which is appointed to actualize something. Okay. And a Kaddish is an even higher angel that causes a flow down to the other one. So ear of a Kaddish is as though the ear would be like the policeman, like the bailiff, and the Kaddish would be like the judge. Okay, so the judge, makes the decree, or the judge gives the, signs off on the arrest order, and the policeman is the one who actually carries the policeman, or the bailiff or whatever is the one who actually carries it out. And to call this single being Irva Kaddish is saying that it's doing both jobs together. That's how Malbim is explaining it to us. I'm going to switch over just for a moment. You're not going to see it unless I decide to actually share this with you. So Ramad Valley doesn't give us that explicit a definition of the difference between Irva Kaddish. He just says it was a single holy being that came down from heaven and made this announcement. Okay, so I'm not going to bother switching over the share because there isn't really anything there. So that was one piece, one other question that had come up last time that I wanted to make sure to answer today before we kept going. And so we had that it was going to be cut down, but its roots were going to stay in the ground, but it was going to be bound with iron and brass, bronze, whatever. Nachash is like nachoshet, copper. Okay, and in the desha. Okay, and from the dew of the heavens, it was going to be drenched, and its portion was going to be with the animals. In other words, its portion of what it was going to get for eating. So now we're really clearly no longer talking about a tree, because trees eat through their roots and through their leaves. They do not eat by moving around like animals, but from the grass of the earth. And then we had this business about the heart, and meaning the understanding, the human understanding was going to be taken away. And the Gzeirat Irim, with this decree of, that the essentially sort of the policeman type of person had decreed the matter. He has the order in his hand. Mamar Kadishin Delta, and the Memar is now So it's a decree from there, and it's the words, but it's the words of the judge that are being carried out. That's how Malbim would explain, again, this duplication of language here. So I was sort of rushing through this last little bit last time because I kept hoping I was going to get further and then ran out of time. So we're going to finish this part off, and then we'll come back to how our Mefarshim understand, some of the deeper things that are hidden in these verses next week. But for this week, he says that he says about this matter that was made known from the high ruler in in his human kingdom, right? Ulamandi Yitzbe Yitnene, whoever he wants to appoint is he can give it to him, Shval Anashim Yakim Ale, and he can bring down whichever people to a low state, and then he can also bring them back up, reestablish them. This was the decree what was the purpose of this being cut down, having the seichel, having the understanding, the human understanding taken away, and for it to be for a period of time, and then for it to come back again. That the whole purpose here was to show that, right, God can give and he can take away, and then he can give back again. And for Nebuchadnezzar, whether you understand him as having a problem of arrogance, or whether you understand it, I didn't actually go back through this. Malbim tends to understand Nebuchadnezzar as having a problem in hashkafa. He, according to the Malbim, earlier he was talking about it, that Nebuchadnezzar saw the world as a static kind of place without a creator. In other words, it was, and it will be, it didn't have a beginning. It doesn't have an end. There's no creator. And there's for sure no hashgacha. And he needed to have, but not just he himself as an individual, but the world needed to have that worldview shown to be false. And so just as in Sefer Shmot, where Kadosh Baruch Hu says over and over again, not only that he's doing all of these makot and all of these signs and wonders, etc., for our sake, in order that we should tell it over to our children, but in order that Paro and his people should also know. In other words, in order that the world should know, there's a need ultimately for the whole world to come to a place of knowing God. And in order for the whole world to come to this place of knowing God, we need to show to be false the idea that the world is it either runs on coincidence, or that it's a deterministic place, that there, in other words, if it's all determined, right? And there are people who have that kind of a worldview today, and it's not avodah zarah in the sense of bowing down to idols and assigning power to somebody, some power that's not God, but it's a different kind of avodah. It's a very large error, and the Malbim tends to see Nebuchadnezzar as being the exponent of this type of error, and so it was important to God to make an object lesson of Nebuchadnezzar himself, and even more so to bring Nebuchadnezzar to a place where he could acknowledge his error, because he had been such a force on the side of the wrong idea that it was important that he be the new spokesperson for the correct way of understanding things. So I'm not quite okay. So this sentence here is central to how the Malbim sees the whole purpose of this entire episode. And then it goes on. So, Dana Chalma Chazit Ana Malka Nebuchadnezzar. This dream is what the king Nebuchadnezzar, saw. Ba'ant, and you, Belshazzar, which is Daniel, Pishrei, you need to interpret it. Emor kol kavel di kol chachimei malchuti la yechalim pishra lahodatumi. Okay, and so you should say, because all of the, despite the fact that all of the wise men of my kingdom were not able to give me a solution for it and to make it known to me, but you, Va'ant Kahel, you're capable of doing it. Why? Diruach Elohim Kadishin Bach, because the spirit of the Holy God is within you. Okay, and remember, according to Malbim anyway, Kadishin has this sense of sort of I said before the judge, but it's the mashpia. It's this higher level that sends the decree out, but it's not, and it can be a decree of goodness, it can be a decree of difficulty, but it's that higher level that is having an influence, but it's not yet actualizing it. And that was how Malbim told us to look at that word Kaddish. Okay. So then Daniel Dishmei Baltzar. Okay, then so it's interesting, right? Because this is not Daniel himself who's saying, remember me, I'm not really Belshazzar. I'm Daniel. I'm me. Okay. This is Nebuchadnezzar himself who's writing it. And so he says, then Daniel. Well, his name is Belshazzar. It's really one and the same person. Eshtomem ksha'ah chada. He was, literally says he was like stricken dumb for an hour. But I would tend to believe that ksha'ah chada here means more for a significant period of time, not necessarily that they actually had a clock and were counting, and at the end of an hour, Nebuchadnezzar said, you're going to say something or not. But he heard the whole thing, and this is what I was saying to you. He was like, and just how am I supposed to interpret this without getting myself in big time trouble? Or, and it's not even just a question of like, I don't think of Daniel as somebody who was like so concerned for his own skin that he was worried about that. But like, there's a message here for the king, obviously. But how do I give it over to him in a way that he can actually hear it? Because like, I don't know how I would explain that to somebody. I would daven over it a lot. How do I give this over? And V'rayunohi Yavaluna. And his thoughts were upsetting him, discombobulating him, exactly for the reason that I said, like, how is he supposed to say this in a way that the king is going to be able to hear? So then Anamalka Vamar Belchatzar Chelma Ufishrei Al Yivhaluch. So the king spoke up and he said, Belchatzar, really? The dream and the solution should not distress you so much, shouldn't discombobulate you so much. Ane Belchatzar Vamar. So Belchatzar, meaning Daniel, speaks up and he says, Mar'i Chelma l'sanach ufishri la'arach. And there's machloket among the Meforshim as to exactly, and not just among the Meforshim, actually, there's Gemara on this, as to exactly what and to whom Daniel is speaking. It appears that he's saying the dream should essentially that the dream should fall on those who hate you. The vision of this dream should fall on those who hate you, and its solution also on the ones who are set up against you. And so the machloket that the Gemara brings is, how could Daniel possibly have said such a thing? Like, obviously, who are the people who hate Nebuchadnezzar the most? It's the Jews. How could Daniel be essentially praying that that this should fall on the Jews? That's horrible. How could he say such a thing? And others who read it with them, sort of the same way, say, no, hold on a second. Nebuchadnezzar would hear that as meaning his enemies. The Jews are slaves. The Jews are not in any position at this point in our history to be able to fight back anymore in any way whatsoever. So Nebuchadnezzar is not going to hear this as it should happen to the Jews. Nebuchadnezzar will hear this as it should happen, to the enemies, whatever his enemies are outside the kingdom. The Jews are now inside the kingdom. It's okay. Daniel's not actually calling down any kind of vengeance on the Jewish people. A different way of reading it altogether is that Daniel wasn't speaking to Nebuchadnezzar here. That Daniel turned to God and said, may this vision happen. May this dream come true on your enemies, meaning God's enemies, meaning the enemies of the Jewish people, meaning it should happen to Nebuchadnezzar. But he said it in a way that Nebuchadnezzar could hear it one way, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu could hear it a different way. And so he said it in two different levels. So if anybody wants, they can send me an email and I'll send you the actual Gemara. But there was a very sweet Gemara on that. And the psukim go on. I've really already gone over time, haven't I? And I hardly got to anything that I wanted to do. But Meira, I still haven't finished what I was supposed to do. Well, at least I got through that little bit about how Daniel manages to talk at two different levels at the same time. I thought that was really cool. All right. We will start with verse 17. I had no clue how late it got all of a sudden I looked at the time. Okay. We will start with verse 17 and get through 25, and then I will go back through and talk about this, the symbols and the pneumius that's actually in the dream, but not until we hear what Daniel actually says. Ta-da! I'm going to have to leave you. I'll leave it there again. Let me stop the share. Okay, and actually, I will stop the YouTube at this point.